Well, I can tell this is a very quick group, and I am sure that you have figured out that I am not Father Remington Sloan. So, for those of you who do not know me, I am Deacon Marsha Holmes. The Sudanese children we visited on a mission trip last month, who now live at Amazing Grace Orphanage in Adjumani, Uganda, are orphans of war. And seeing these children at Amazing Grace was, of course, the highlight of our trip. But there are other parts of the trip that I want to reflect on today. In addition to the children at Amazing Grace, there are also children who remain in one of the refugee settlements. A couple times in the past, I've reflected here on patience, or more correctly, my lack of it, and how God has from time to time created opportunities for me to experience its need and be better for it. This trip provided several opportunities for me to see just what I can experience if I am patient. The first lesson occurred when our flight from Jacksonville was delayed due to thunderstorms that were long enough for us to miss our international connection to Brussels. But the experience that I want to talk about today occurred on our way to visit the children still in the refugee settlement. We had to cross the Nile River on a ferry. I am convinced that God meant for me to see life differently, beginning while I waited for that next ferry. Not moan and groan about the idle time, but pay attention to His creation while we were waiting. We arrived at the ferry terminal, and I use the word terminal very loosely, just in time for the 11 o'clock short trip across the Nile. But because that ferry was full, we had to wait for the next ferry, which was about 2.5 hours later because of a lunch break. God presented a moment when we could do nothing but wait. There was no other way to cross the river. He presented me with another opportunity to experience patience and observe a different part of His world. I saw many things that reflect the culture of the people of Uganda. There were small local markets at the ferry terminal that sold, among other things, smoked salmon, raw sugar cane, which we got to taste and enjoy, and a very popular snack, white ants. Women and a few men were carrying baskets on their heads, and I only wish that my posture were good enough to be able to accomplish that. Mothers were nursing their babies. Some men were in suits and some dressed casually. Some women in their native dress. People were talking in languages that I do not understand, but could hear the joy in their words. Children were holding on to their mothers. Children were running and playing. It all came together when just a few days ago, I traveled to Baltimore. So I spent a portion of 2 days in a different transportation terminal, in airports. There were shops and restaurants where I could buy food and snacks, maybe not white ants, but food and snacks just the same. People carried their possessions with them in rollerboard suitcases instead of sacks. There were children playing on the floor and even a mother nursing. There were squeals of laughter and sounds of joy. The language was one that I understood, and the communication between people quite the same as in Uganda, I'm sure. Some men and some women were dressed in business suits and some more casually. But whether at a Ugandan ferry terminal or in an American airport, there was one thing that was the same. All the people I saw were God's children, living life in effectively the same way, doing the same things in slightly different ways, but enjoying God's gift of life. I often think that my life is so very different from those in other parts of the world, but I realize that it's really not that different. Going to church on Sunday was, of course, on our schedule. The church we attended is a part of the Episcopal Diocese of South Sudan and Sudan. We were ready to go when our guide, Tom's really good friend, Esban, came to say that church was delayed. You see, it rained quite hard that night and early morning. Unless there's a hurricane, we take getting around in the rain as a non-event. But many Ugandans must walk to church on dirt roads, or even if they had cars, roads may not be passable. What is important to note is that church was not canceled. It was delayed until the people could get there. When the service began, the church was full, and the service was truly a celebration of God's love. There was preaching, which was translated for us, singing, and we all danced. And by the way, Deanne is really good at Ugandan church dancing. Absolutely worth the wait. Truly a celebration of God's love by people who significantly are affected by war, by refugees from South Sudan who have been displaced from their homes and property. In all they've gone through and continue to go through, there was a clear knowledge that God is with them and loves them. And there is no doubt that they love him. There is one other perspective that I'd like to share today. Many of you know that I have a passion for photography. I often get asked, how can you enjoy a trip when you're always behind the camera? And the joke on our recent trip is that Art Billingsley had the only evidence that I was actually on the trip. He made sure that he took some pictures that I was in. So why am I even talking to you about taking photographs? Well, there are a few things that I love to take pictures of. One of them is flowers. I love the color. The other is animals in their natural environment. But what I love the most is taking pictures of people. Not portraits, but people in their native dress. People usually not posed, but people just enjoying life. In my journey to Uganda, I spent a great deal of time behind the camera. From behind the camera, here is what I saw. Faces that looked different from mine, but not so different. Faces that were beautifully made by the same God that we both worship. Faces of children who were joyful in spite of perhaps not yet knowing the challenges of the world that they face. The face of Mama Susan, whose love for these children was unrelenting. The face of a young woman, Sarah, who grew up in the orphanage and now works there to make sure other young orphans have an opportunity. The face of a man named Esban, who is sometimes torn between the modern world and tribal tradition, but whose smile and personality captivated me as he engaged with the children. The smiling, loving faces of the children who remained at one of the refugee camps. The faces of women hanging clothes or watching children in the yards of one-room homes built in family compounds around the roadside. The sometimes stern yet loving face of a retired government official who has donated the use of his land to grow vegetables so that these children can be fed. The important thing to me about these faces is that they are all faces, beautifully made, wonderfully made faces of the children of the God that I worship. The faces look a little or maybe a lot different than you and me, yet they look the same. On my first trip to Bolivia 12 years ago, I learned very quickly that I get a lot more than I think I give on mission trips. Well, it was the same in Uganda. I know I felt the great love they offered me, and I hope they felt the love I offered them. I have a card that says, "Your gifts are what God has given you. What you do with them is your gift to God." One of the gifts God gave me is an eye for photography. What I do with it is my gift to God, and tonight I hope a gift to you. I hope that you will join us for dinner tonight. There'll be a slideshow of photographs of the faces of God's children, a few animals and flowers thrown in, but mostly the faces of love. I hope that you will see what I saw: beauty in the color of the flowers, beauty in the beasts and the fowl, beauty in the faces of the children and adults, beauty in all of God's creation.